Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishna Pesachim, Perek Tes, Chapter 9, Mishna Vav, Mishnah 6. Amar Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua said, Shamati, I heard from my teachers, Shetamuras HaPesach Kreva. Now, a Tamura is the following. The Torah says that if you have a carbon, and you decide that you want to substitute another animal for that animal that you designated as a carbon. So you want to make it a tamura, you want to make it an exchange, you want to make it a substitute. So number one, you're not allowed to do that. Number two, if you do it, then the animal that you use as a substitute becomes sanctified, but the original animal that you wanted to replace stays the same. You made the tamura because you thought that you could say, you designated an animal for a carbon, for a sacrifice. You thought that I'll take this one and make it a tamura, I'll make an exchange for that one, so that the original one shouldn't be sanctified anymore, and just the exchange should be sanctified. The Torah says, nope, both are going to remain sanctified. The first one stays sanctified, the new one becomes sanctified. And the new one that becomes sanctified takes on the same laws as the one that it was meant to substitute. If the one that was meant to substitute is an oila, then it becomes an oila. If the other one was the original was a shlamim, then it becomes a shlamim, and it is offered as such. Now, in Yeshua's case, he said, I heard the following statement from my teachers. Temuras ha-pesach kreva. The temura of a carbon pesach is offered. Utemuras ha-pesach eina kreva. And the temura, the substitute for a carbon pesach, is not offered. Meaning sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. The ein lefarish, but I don't know how to explain it. I forgot how they explained it. So that was the statement. He knew that as Rebbeim had taught, there are times when the tamur, the exchange, or the substitute was referred to it as a substitute. The substitute of a carbon pesach is offered, and sometimes it's not offered, but he couldn't remember which one was which. What were the cases? Now, if we're talking about a carbon, now the substitute for a carbon pesach, if it's offered, we're saying it's going to be offered as a carbon shlamim, because the rule is that any animal designated as a carbon pesach that for some reason wasn't offered, what do you do with it? You bring it as a shlamim, because a carbon pesach essentially is a type of a shlamim. So if you don't bring it as a carbon pesach itself, then you bring it as a shlamim. So therefore, the same thing would also be if, let's say, you had a carbon pesach and you redeemed it onto money. The money is now going to be used for a carbon shlamim. So now, in this case, Rabbi Yeshua said there was a case where the temura of a pesach is offered, which would be as a shlamim. In other places, it's not offered as a shlamim, which would mean if it's not offered as a shlamim, what would happen to it? You'd have to allow it to graze on its own, get blemished, and once it gets blemished, you can redeem it onto money, and then the money would then be offered as a carbon shlamim. That's what would happen. But now the question is, what are the circumstances? So Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said, "Ani afarish, I'll explain it to you. Ha-pesach shenimtza koidem shchitas ha-pesach, a carbon pesach that was found before the other carbon pesach was slaughtered. The case is, you had an animal, you designated a carbon pesach, and it wandered off. You lost it. You can't find it. So what are you going to do? So you take another animal, and you designate it as a carbon pesach. Now, what happened in this case was, before it came time to slaughter, the old one showed up. So now you got a choice. You want to take the old one, you want to take the new one. Now, the new one, even if we refer to it as a substitute, it's not a tamura. It wasn't meant to be a tamura. You didn't say it should be a substitute for that. Basically, you went ahead and you took another animal and sanctified it as a carbon pesach anew, because you thought the first one was you lost the first one. Now you have both in front of you. Which one do you use? The answer is whichever one you want. The thing is, though, that what happens now is that if, let's say, you decide that I'm going to use the new one, the second one, I'm going to use that for my carbon pesach. So I could have used the first one, and I didn't. When you do that, when you have this opportunity, when you have the ability or the opportunity to bring an animal that was sanctified to be a carbon, and you decided you rejected it, you said, no, I'm not bringing it. That's called the dichui. That's called dichui, referred to as pushed off, rejected. And an animal that's rejected cannot be brought as a carbon anymore. You can't bring it as a carbon. Meaning, you would say, okay, I went ahead, I chose, I lost the first one, I designated another one, I found the first one, but now I'm going to bring the second one. All right, so the first one as a carbon Pesach, it was designated a carbon Pesach, and it wasn't brought as a carbon Pesach. What should you be doing with it? Bring it as a shlamim. But the answer is I can't, because in this case, I rejected it. I had the opportunity to use it, and I didn't. That's called dichui. And once an animal is rejected, I can't use it anymore. Now, okay, I can't use it, but what do I do with it? Can I redeem it now? The answer is no, you can't redeem it yet. It's yira achi yistoiv. You then allow it to pasture until it becomes blemished, because typically the animal out there pasturing on its own is going to get blemished. The yamacher, once it's blemished, then you can sell it, which means you're redeeming it. You're transferring the sanctity from the animal to the money. The animal now is chulin. It's unconsecrated. Do what you want to do. Make a barbecue out of it. V'yikach b'dam of shlamim. But now this money that now became sanctified from this animal, it was sanctified from a carbon pesach that was not brought. And now what do you do with the money? You buy a shlamim with it. The animal was rejected. The animal can't be brought. But the money that's used to redeem it, to replace it, that could be brought. And therefore, that's the halacha. So this is step number one. Step number one is that we're talking that says Rabbi Akiva, the Pesach that we say that you can't, well let's put it this way. So that's the first step, rather. So you've got this case, you had a carbon Pesach, a designated animal, carbon Pesach, you lost it. You then went and took another animal and designated it for the carbon Pesach. You found the first animal. You decided to bring the second one. That makes the first one rejected. Because it's rejected, it cannot be brought as a carbon Pesach. What do you do with it? Let it get a blemish. Once it's blemished, you can redeem it. Now, our discussion was a temura, right? That was our discussion, temura. So Rabbi Akiva says, v'chein temurasai. The same thing applies to its temura. That means if this animal that was rejected, what did I do? I then decided to take another animal and to say that I want this to be the substitute for that, meaning I want the sanctity to transfer onto this animal. What happens then? The new one becomes sanctified with the same status as the first, but the first stays the same. So now when you have to deal with the temura, when you have to deal with the exchange, it's the same idea. That temura cannot be brought as a sacrifice because it came from because it originated from an animal that was nitcha, that was rejected. So now the temura also, it pastures, it gets blemished. Once it gets blemished, you redeem it. You redeem it for money, and then you take the money and bring a carbon shlamim with it. So that's the case of where we say the temura of a Pesach cannot be brought. Because we're talking about, it's a temura of an animal that was nitcha, that was rejected. But again, that's all because the old animal was found before you shechted and before you actually shechted a carbon Pesach. However, Pesach, let's say the lost animal shows up after the slaughtering of the carbon Pesach. So now that animal was not rejected. You can't be rejected if you weren't around. If you were lost and there was no ability to bring it, you're not rejected. Oh, it's not rejected. Then what happens to it? Karev shlamim. It itself now is a carbon Pesach that was left over. It was never brought as a carbon Pesach. It now is offered as a shlamim. V'chein temurasai. The same thing applies to its temura. If this animal, that now the lost animal that was found after the shechita of the carbon Pesach, that we say it is offered as a shlamim. If you take another animal and make it a temura onto that, you say this should be a substitute for that, then that new animal gets the same status of the original animal, and it will be brought as a carbon shlamim. So that's the case of where we say that the temura of a carbon Pesach is offered. So this is how Rabbi Akiva explained what Rabbi Shua heard from his Rebbeim. Now, if you think about it, there should be a very obvious question here. And I'm going to let you know right now, I don't have an answer for it. Because in the notes, they say it's a Gemara's discussion, but they just bring down the question because it's so obvious. Really, the difference here has nothing to do with Temura. it's really a discussion about an animal that was rejected or not. The Tamura is just a result of what was it a Tamura for. So it's not per se about a Tamura. And therefore, the obvious question is, why did Rabbi Yeshua's Rebbeim talk about a Tamura when the real discussion is not about a Tamura? The real discussion is about an animal that was lost and then it was found. Was it rejected or not? That's the real discussion. So why did they frame it about in the context of a Tamura? So they bring down here from the Taisvis Yantif, the Gemara asks the question, and the Gemara deals with why they did it that way. But for our purposes, this is the pshat. This is the explanation of the Mishnah. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I can't.